The war in Ukraine entered a new phase on March 19, 2025. A partial ceasefire agreement focusing on energy infrastructure was reached between Ukraine and Russia. This fragile truce aimed to provide a much-needed respite from the relentless attacks on critical energy facilities. These attacks had plunged Ukrainian cities into darkness and left millions struggling to survive the harsh winter. The ceasefire, while limited in scope, offered a glimmer of hope for a potential de-escalation of the conflict. However, the agreement was met with cautious optimism at best. The international community, while welcoming the ceasefire, remained wary of Russia's true intentions. Previous attempts at ceasefires and peace talks had crumbled. These failures left many doubting whether this latest agreement would hold. The focus on energy infrastructure, while crucial for humanitarian reasons, also raised concerns. Was this a strategic move by Russia to secure its own energy interests in the region? The coming days and weeks would be critical in determining the success or failure of the ceasefire. The world watched closely, hoping that this fragile truce might pave the way for a more lasting peace in war-torn Ukraine. The human cost of the conflict had been immeasurable. The international community yearned for a resolution that would end the bloodshed and suffering. The ceasefire, though limited, represented a small step towards peace. It remained to be seen whether it would be a first step towards a negotiated settlement or another broken promise in a brutal war. Only time would tell if this fragile truce could withstand the weight of history and the complex geopolitical forces at play. The partial ceasefire agreement was a result of intense diplomatic efforts. Former US President Donald Trump played a pivotal role. He engaged in separate phone calls with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump's involvement, though unexpected, underscored the continued global significance of the conflict. Zelensky, facing immense pressure on the ground, approached the ceasefire with a mix of hope and skepticism. He understood the urgent need for a respite from Russian aggression. However, he remained acutely aware of Putin's history of using ceasefires as a tactical ploy. Zelensky knew that any truce would need to be closely monitored and enforced. Putin, on the other hand, saw the ceasefire as an opportunity to advance his own strategic interests. By focusing on energy infrastructure, he aimed to exploit Ukraine's dependence on its energy grid. This tactic, he believed, could give him leverage in any future negotiations. Trump's role in mediating the ceasefire was met with mixed reactions. Some praised his willingness to engage in high-stakes diplomacy. Others questioned his motivations and the potential for renewed tensions between the US and its allies. The complex web of relationships and competing interests added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. The ceasefire agreement, while fragile, represented a delicate balancing act between these powerful players. Each leader had their own motivations, their own red lines, and their own vision for the future of Ukraine. The outcome of this high-stakes diplomatic game remained uncertain. What was clear was that the fate of Ukraine hung precariously in the balance. As part of the partial ceasefire agreement, technical teams from the US, Ukraine and Russia were scheduled to meet in Saudi Arabia. This neutral ground aimed to facilitate discussions on the implementation and potential expansion of the ceasefire. The talks were expected to be tense and complex, reflecting the deep mistrust between the parties involved. The primary focus of the talks was the establishment of mechanisms to ensure the protection of energy infrastructure. Both sides accused each other of violating previous agreements and targeting civilian facilities. Establishing clear guidelines and monitoring mechanisms was crucial for building confidence in the ceasefire. Beyond energy, the talks also aimed to explore the possibility of expanding the ceasefire to other critical areas. These included humanitarian corridors for the delivery of aid and the potential for a safe passage agreement for ships carrying grain from Ukrainian ports. The choice of Saudi Arabia as the venue for the talks underscored the kingdom's growing influence in mediating international conflicts. Saudi Arabia, with its close ties to both Russia and the West, was seen as a potential bridge builder in the conflict. The success of the talks in Saudi Arabia was far from guaranteed. However, they represented a crucial opportunity for dialogue and de-escalation. The international community urged all parties to engage in good faith and to prioritize the urgent need for peace and stability in the region. Despite the partial ceasefire agreement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky remained cautiously skeptical. His skepticism was rooted in the bitter experience of past broken promises by Russia. Previous ceasefires had crumbled, with Russia using the respite to regroup and rearm. Zelensky, in his address to the nation, acknowledged the urgent need for a reduction in hostilities. However, he emphasized that Ukraine would not be swayed by empty gestures. He demanded concrete actions from Russia, including a complete withdrawal of its forces from Ukrainian territory. Adding to Zelensky's skepticism were reports of continued attacks by Russian forces, even after the ceasefire announcement. Ukrainian officials accused Russia of using the cover of the ceasefire to target civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and schools. Zelensky's doubts resonated deeply with the Ukrainian people, who had endured unimaginable suffering during the war. They had witnessed firsthand Russia's brutality and its disregard for international law. Trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. The partial ceasefire, while offering a glimmer of hope, was seen by many Ukrainians as a potential trap. They feared that Russia would exploit any lull in fighting to further its own interests. Only time would tell whether Zelensky's skepticism was warranted, or whether this ceasefire would mark a genuine turning point in the conflict. Section 5, an American grid, Trump's controversial proposal for Ukrainian power. In a move that surprised many, former US President Donald Trump proposed a controversial solution to secure Ukraine's energy future: US ownership of Ukrainian power plants. Trump argued that this unprecedented step would ensure the stability of Ukraine's energy grid and prevent future Russian attacks on these critical facilities. Trump's proposal, while presented as a way to support Ukraine, was met with skepticism and concern from both Ukrainians and the international community. Critics questioned the legality and feasibility of such a move. They also raised concerns about the potential for escalating tensions with Russia. Ukrainian officials, while appreciative of US support, expressed reservations about relinquishing control of their critical infrastructure to a foreign power. They argued that such a move would undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and potentially create new vulnerabilities. The proposal also sparked debate within the US, with some questioning the wisdom of such a significant financial and military commitment. Others argued that it was a necessary step to counter Russian aggression and protect US interests in the region. Trump's proposal, while ultimately not pursued, highlighted the ongoing debate about the extent of US involvement in the conflict. It also underscored the complex challenges of rebuilding and securing Ukraine's war-torn infrastructure. Section 6, ceasefire under fire, reports of continued fighting despite agreements. Despite the partial ceasefire agreement, reports of continued fighting and violations by both sides emerged. Ukrainian officials accused Russian forces of launching drone and missile strikes on energy facilities, contradicting the terms of the truce. They also alleged that Russian-backed separatists continued to shell Ukrainian positions in the east. Russia, in turn, accused Ukraine of sabotaging the ceasefire. They claimed that Ukrainian forces had attacked a Russian oil depot and were using the ceasefire as a cover to regroup and rearm. Both sides denied the accusations, blaming the other for the ongoing violence. The continued fighting, despite the ceasefire agreement, underscored the deep mistrust and animosity between the two sides. It also highlighted the challenges of implementing and monitoring such agreements in a complex and volatile conflict zone. The international community expressed concern over the violations, urging both sides to respect the ceasefire and return to the negotiating table. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, tasked with monitoring the ceasefire, called for an immediate de-escalation of hostilities. The fragile truce, already strained by skepticism and mistrust, was further tested by the reports of continued fighting. The situation on the ground remained precarious, with the potential for a full-scale resumption of hostilities looming large. Section 7, unwavering support. US aid and intelligence bolster Ukraine's defense. Amidst the fragile ceasefire and ongoing negotiations, the United States reaffirmed its commitment to supporting Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. The US pledged to continue providing Ukraine with military aid, including advanced air defense systems, and to share critical intelligence to help counter Russian offensives. The Biden administration, facing pressure from both Democrats and Republicans in Congress, maintained that supporting Ukraine was crucial for defending democratic values and deterring further Russian aggression in the region. They argued that a Russian victory in Ukraine would embolden Putin and pose a direct threat to US interests and allies in Europe. The US also continued to work with its European allies to impose further sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, aiming to cripple Putin's ability to finance the war effort. The US and its allies also sought to pressure China to use its influence on Russia to de-escalate the conflict. Russia, in response to the continued US support for Ukraine, accused the West of prolonging the conflict and escalating tensions. They demanded that the US and its allies cease all military aid to Ukraine and engage in direct negotiations with Russia to find a political solution. The US support for Ukraine, both military and diplomatic, remained a critical factor in the conflict. It provided Ukraine with the means to defend itself against a larger and more powerful adversary. The US commitment to Ukraine's security sent a strong message to Russia and the world that the US would stand by its allies and partners in the face of aggression. Section 8. Prisoners of war. A glimmer of hope amidst continued conflict. In a rare glimmer of hope amidst the ongoing conflict, Russia and Ukraine conducted a large prisoner exchange. This humanitarian gesture saw 175 prisoners from each side return home after months, and in some cases years, of captivity. The prisoner exchange, while not directly related to the ceasefire agreement, was seen as a positive sign that dialogue and cooperation between the two sides were still possible. It offered a ray of hope to families who had long awaited the return of their loved ones. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which facilitated the exchange, called on both sides to build on this momentum and prioritize the humane treatment of prisoners of war. They urged both Russia and Ukraine to fully comply with international humanitarian law, which prohibits torture, ill treatment, and arbitrary detention. The prisoner exchange, while a positive development, did not diminish the urgency of finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The war continued to rage on, claiming countless lives and displacing millions. The humanitarian cost of the conflict was staggering, with no end in sight. Despite the ongoing fighting and the fragile nature of the ceasefire, the prisoner exchange served as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity and compassion could prevail. It offered a glimmer of hope that even amidst the horrors of war, acts of kindness and reconciliation were still possible. Section 9. A fragile peace, uncertain future for Ukraine and the region. The partial ceasefire agreement, while a positive step, ushered in a period of fragile peace in Ukraine. The situation on the ground remained volatile, with reports of violations and continued fighting. The future of Ukraine, and indeed the region, remained uncertain, hanging precariously in the balance. The success of the ceasefire and any future peace negotiations hinged on a number of factors. These included the willingness of both sides to engage in good faith, the international community's resolve in holding Russia accountable for its aggression, and the Ukrainian people's determination to defend their homeland. The conflict had profound implications for international relations and the global order. It challenged the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe and raised fundamental questions about the future of democracy and the rule of law. The war in Ukraine was a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the fragility of peace. It underscored the urgent need for diplomacy, dialogue, and a renewed commitment to international cooperation. The world watched and waited, hoping that this fragile peace would hold and that a lasting solution could be found to end the bloodshed and suffering in Ukraine.